Welcome everybody. My name is Aoife Monks. I am a member of staff in the drama department at Queen Mary. I'm also the arts and culture lead for the university. I'm delighted that you're joining us for this conversation on vaccine hesitancy. It's one of 18 conversations that we're hosting this week in honor of 27 commissions that we made last year for artists and community organizations to have conversations with academics at Queen Mary. And that was really at the moment where conversation seemed to matter more than ever, just after the first lockdown, where it felt incredibly important that people make contact with each other to sustain themselves during a particularly difficult time. So we've hosted 18 events this week in order to celebrate that spirit of conversation. And I'm really grateful and lucky to have some astonishing colleagues joining me here today. I should say, though, this is a conversation that's actually been going on for almost a year. The Institute of Humanities invited us all as a multidisciplinary group to come together to think about the different disciplinary responses to the COVID crisis. And of course, the question of something like vaccine hesitancy and the trust it requires can't ever be resolved by a single set of disciplinary experts. Even while we might think about something like vaccination as a medical question, questions of trust actually play out in all kinds of fora around how we believe or think about experts and expertise, our relationship to government and the workings of the state on our bodies, legal systems and questions of security, economics and finance, and of course the ways in which art has shaped our understanding of pandemics and vaccination. I'm sure lots of us during the first lockdown turned in thoughts to the apocalyptic films and literature that we were familiar with, and some of the ways our responses to the pandemic have emerged have been very much shaped by fictional forms. Indeed, my own thoughts as a theatre scholar and an historian of the theatre were really turned to the question of the act of applause as an act of building or promoting or undoing trust during this period. Clapping, after all, is that consummate theatrical act. And I was fascinated by the moment of clapping for carers in the ways that NHS workers got cast as heroes within this moment of community engagement. As someone who writes about 19th century popular theatre, particularly melodrama, which is a working class theatrical form, I was very interested by the moral legibility that clapping for carers seemed to first produce. And I was thinking of melodrama as a form that really promoted moral legibility, where we have an instantly recognizable hero who is always working class, and equally instantly recognizable villains, usually known by their black beards and capes, who are always members of the middle classes, not least bankers, lawyers, and landlords. So working class audiences would gather together to cheer for heroes and applaud them and boo the villain with great certainty. And of course, we can really disparage this moral certainty, see it as a form of naivety even. But we have to remember that those audiences had themselves undergone massive social change and even crisis, usually coming straight off the land or from all over the world to major industrial spaces like London. And the act of applauding with others wasn't simply an act of naivety. It was a way of gaining a sense of community, a formation of new working class identity, and a way of making the world readable when it felt so deeply bewildering and confusing. And it makes me wonder whether clapping for carers was actually really never actually about the NHS. Rather, it was a way of building community in a moment of enormous crisis in which people could feel membership and loyalty to each other. It may not necessarily have helped the NHS, but it may well have promoted trust in systems that required our compliance. In other words, applauding wasn't simply a performance of appreciation. It may have in fact produced trust. However, applauding is never an unambivalent act. And even if we turn to the Oxford English Dictionary's definition, we can see that it calls it the striking of palms of the hands together with noise, usually in token of encouragement or delight, formerly also in derision. And if you look at the audiences for 19th century melodrama, you can see in Belfast, for example, that audiences would applaud and boo different villains and heroes depending on whether they were Catholics or Protestants. And the actors certainly knew who was who by what got thrown at them from the auditorium, rivets from the Protestant shipworkers and cobblestones by the Catholics. And indeed, the kind of ambivalence that emerged around clapping for carers also suggests that these acts that may promote trust can also undo them. The ways in which Boris Johnson's claim that we should also clap for bankers produced such derision in response, reproducing the sense that bankers are always the villains. And indeed, the fact that a slow hand clap was proposed as a response to the 1% NHS pay rise. It demonstrates that actions that apparently promote trust can very quickly reverse or come to mean opposite things when the structural changes needed to support that trust don't come through. They suggest that trust can be produced in unexpected ways by clapping and lost equally quickly. And they also suggest that just as NHS workers can get cast as heroes using militaristic language like being on the front line and battling COVID, equally the structures of the NHS can be viewed as villainous by those who understand it as operating on behalf of the state on their bodies, particularly among communities who may be suspicious of the state for very good historical reasons. So to think about vaccine hesitancy and trust then is clearly never only a question for medical experts. And I'm delighted to welcome a whole set of colleagues from business management, law, public health, film, and politics to join us and talk about these questions. I should say that Sarah Wolff was due to join us for this conversation and sadly couldn't because of an outbreak of COVID in her daughter's school, which is sadly apt for this topic. So I'm going to invite you to eavesdrop into a conversation that we've been having for quite some time. And of course, to join into it by adding your thoughts and ideas to the chat. And we will draw on your questions and contributions as we go along and when we return for a Q&A at the end. So I'm going to welcome our first conversationalist today, who is David McCoy, who's a professor of global public health and director of the Centre for Public Health at Queen Mary. David, thank you so much for joining us. Your insight is incredibly valuable for this conversation. I wonder if we could start by maybe talking a little bit about how the public understanding and reputation of medical and public health experts has transformed over the course of the COVID crisis.
I think it's probably too early to give a definitive answer to that question. What I do know, however, is that COVID has really revealed to many people just how important trust is to communicable disease control, whether it's compliance with the measures around physical distancing, quarantine, isolation, and as we see with vaccine hesitancy, trust is an absolutely critical ingredient to communicable disease control. Not only is trust protective, but mistrust can be positively harmful. And we saw that with Ebola in West Africa, where mistrust in government, mistrust in the security forces actually resulted in behaviors that put the community at greater risk. So trust is both protective and mistrust can be harmful. And I think trust has always been important for public health, not just for communicable disease control, but if you think about how public health is also about preventing diseases, you've got to somehow convince people to do things in order to gain a benefit, further down the line in the future. And it does take trust to get people to act and behave that way. And then with public health as well, you're often trying to get people to do things that will benefit other people. So once again, you've got trust as being a really crucial, critical ingredient in public health. And maybe just a final point to add is the fact that we've known, particularly in medicine, that trust in itself is therapeutic. If you are able to trust your doctor, regardless of what clinical, whatever the doctor does clinically, that trust in itself has a therapeutic benefit. And I think you can also say the same thing with public health. Societies which have good levels of generalized trust are societies that are probably happier and healthier.
It's a really fascinating point, which makes me wonder whether it seems sort of obvious that you would have greater compliance with these measures the more trust there is in government. It makes me wonder whether the opposite might also be true, that the more compliant we are, the more we trust, whether compliance actually produces trust through the kind of investment that we have within those systems, which I think is fascinating.
Yeah, I think so, but it does depend on the outcome. So if compliance produces good outcomes, it will rebuild or kind of build trust even more. But if the outcomes aren't positive, then you create mistrust. And I kind of think about the Dominic Cummings affair. And again, anecdotally, but I'm sure there's now evidence been kind of generated through research that affair really did impact on trust, and it did have an impact on some people choosing to be less compliant with public health measures.
You mentioned Ebola, and I wonder if you could tell us how past pandemics, what they've taught us about how to counteract vaccine hesitancy.
Again, I think the big lesson has always been about trust, that you do have to build trust. And the lesson is probably that you can lose trust very easily, and it takes a long time to rebuild that trust. So, you can't respond quickly to an acute pandemic with quick and easy solutions to building up trust. You have to build that trust in preparation for an event like we've had with COVID. And the literature about trust will also say that trust in itself is not necessarily always going to produce good outcomes. If you put your trust in the wrong people or the wrong information, it can come back and harm you. And I'm doing a little bit of research looking at vaccine hesitancy amongst social care workers and care home workers. And one of the interesting kind of bits of information coming out from that has been how the younger generation of care home workers seem to have much more trust in what's presented on social media, much more so than they do with public health experts or with the government. And they've explained it as being something that they've grown up with, that they've grown up with social media, that's where they get their information from. And also this idea that you can see things on social media. So you see pictures of people who've gone to hospital, apparently because they've had a reaction to the vaccine. And by virtue of seeing a picture of that, they have a trust in that as being real, credible information, as opposed to what one informant described as just the words and numbers presented on the kind of evening briefings. So trust can sometimes be a bad thing.
Yeah, of course. I mean, what you're saying there returns to that point, perhaps, that trust has to be a multidisciplinary problem. In a sense, it requires multidisciplinary expertise. It sounds like we need experts in digital communication to advise on how to shape those narratives differently. And that makes me ask you what you think the medical community need from other disciplines or expertise to help build trust, or help build trust in the right direction, as you're saying. So not only build trust, but refine it. So to support the vaccine program. What are the disciplinary forms of help you think the medical community need?
Yeah, I mean, the research that I'm doing now is really, to a large extent, anthropological and social science research, and understanding how people make sense of information, and also getting an understanding of who people believe in, who people trust, who they don't trust in. I mean, that's incredibly important and useful information to have. In England, doctors and health workers are still trusted. They're still up there, the top of people that people generally trust. And I think this is largely because, people associate healthcare workers with the NHS. The NHS is seen as a public service, a public institution, not run for commercial reasons or objectives. But I fear that over time, that level of assumed trust in healthcare workers is going to disappear as the NHS becomes increasingly commercialized. And, you know, I guess what I'm saying here, Aoife, is that doctors and health workers need to understand the consequences of some of the reforms on the NHS and what impact it will have on them and their relationships with patients, if you're a clinician, or relationships with communities and populations, if you work in public health. I think the commercialization that we've seen in the NHS, but also with the, you know, the response to COVID, with the outsourcing of testing and contact tracing, that's going to erode at the way in which in England and in the UK, there's been this long tradition of the population trusting and believing in the NHS. And that's, you know, not something that we can take for granted going forward, unfortunately.
That's a sobering but very good note to end on, David. Obviously, you're coming back again for a conversation at the end, but thank you so much for your conversation so far. That was fantastic. Thank you. I wonder if I could turn now to Stella, who is a senior lecturer in public management in our School of Business Management. And Stella, I wonder if you could offer us a kind of a perspective on the difference in how the EU and UK have managed the vaccine programme. I know this is work you're doing right at the moment. We're having access to, you know, right on the pulse research here. Could you talk to us a little bit about those differences in approaches and what you've observed?
Yes, this is work that we have been doing with Sarah. So I'm trying to bring in a little bit of her points. Thank you. And I will try to relate it also to the trust issue. I think this pandemic happened exactly at the worst moment for the UK and the EU, and in a way, even describing the different strategies that these two entities have taken is like participating in this vaccine war that has we are unfortunately experiencing, and that is actually affecting trust. So we're talking about two completely different entities. The EU is not a state. The EU didn't have a health policy. So the EU is only, the members of the EU are only collaborating, but they have not given power to the EU to have a policy. So it was a very fast response. So what we discuss and see as a failure, I don't think it was a failure. It was a fast response to do as much as possible, in the sense that we actually have a common vaccine strategy at the moment. So the member states are not competing with each other for vaccines, but we have one strategy in the EU. Now, the rollout of the vaccination has been much worse than in the UK. I think this is the best moment of the UK, the vaccination rollout. And it had to be, because the government would have completely failed if it didn't. For the EU, it's not the same, not so much because there was no policy, but there is no supply, and the agreements made with the pharmaceuticals were not the best that they could have done. So in brief, I think this is what we can say.
Brilliant, thank you. How would you read vaccine hesitancy in relation to wider questions of trust or compliance in systems of public management? So how is it an expression of perhaps something wider or more systemic?
Yes, I think it is. It has to do with wider issues of trust towards public institutions, as David was also saying. But I think what we see now, the hesitancy that we see right now, I think that it's perfectly understandable and in a way legitimate. I think we have messed it up here. And in a way, I say we, because I think we experts are part of the problem. We are used to question, to be critical, and to give various different options when we give an answer. This is not what we need right now. We need much more certainty and much more concrete answers, and we don't know how to do it. So we have been talking for a while that we need to learn how to communicate, but this has not been so successful in this case. So what is happening now with the AstraZeneca vaccine and the Johnson & Johnson vaccine really shows that you cannot leave experts alone trying to explain to the people, but also governments don't want to take the blame. So they're taking measures that are not probably absolutely necessary, but there is a lack of proper communication right now. So I think this is where we are.
And I mean, that makes me turn to the theme of our conversation, which is on the future of trust. And I'm wondering how you think trust in governments is going to change in the future, given the increased role of experts and evidence. So as you're saying, the kind of desire to use experts sometimes as the scapegoats, perhaps, how do you think trust will change in government in the future accordingly?
Yes, I think we need to learn from this crisis, which is probably similar to the Ebola crisis that David was mentioning, but now it's global. So there is much more room there for us to learn and to understand which role each of the actors can play. So many times it was not clear that the decisions are made by governments and that experts are only advising. On the other hand, it was good to have experts in the communication strategy of governments because, as we were saying, they are more trusted. Doctors are more trusted. Scientists more often are trusted. This is also what our survey that we are conducting now in 4 countries is showing. But at the same time, we need clarity and we need communication skills that were not there. In a way, communication is even more important than policy right now. So even if the policy is not perfect, it needs to be perfectly communicated to be sure that we have compliance. So I think this will be even more clear in the future.
Fascinating. Can you just tell us which countries you are surveying? So who are you looking at?
So the survey, it's UK, Sweden, Germany, and Greece. It's a European survey to be able to compare. And we have also global profiles of what experts did in 24 countries around the globe, how they advised governments. We will soon let you know about it.
Great. I think when I said that it would be nice to have a conversation in a room with bad sandwiches, we might reconvene this discussion and hear more from your work when you actually publish it. Thank you so much, Stella. That was really, really useful and interesting. Thank you. I wonder if I could invite Gülnur to join us now, who is Professor of Finance in the School of Business Management. Gülnur, thank you so much for being here. You've suggested we watch a clip very quickly, which of course will be familiar to many of us. So I wonder, Louisa, who is helping us with the manage the Zoom experience. Louisa, would you mind playing that film for us, please? The Guardian clip. We'll just have a moment of digital waiting. Here we go. Great. Thank you, Louisa.
So I've just come out of the supermarket. There's no fruit and veg. I had a little cry in there. I'm a critical care nurse. I've just finished 48 hours of work. I just wanted to get some stuff in for the next 48 hours. There's no fruit, there's no vegetables. I just don't know how I'm supposed to stay healthy. And there's people and people are just stripping the shelves of basic foods. You just need to stop it. Because there's people like me that are going to be looking after you when you're at your lowest. Just stop it, please.
Wow. It brings us back, and what an amazingly powerful film. Gülnur, you're a professor of finance. Can you talk to us about what that film speaks to in your own research?
Well, I mean, I have worked on a paper with my colleague Arman Eshraghi from Cardiff, which is basically based on that clip. And to us, what's important is the collapse of a system. So bank runs, for example, are very rare. And in the UK, in 2008, we've seen a bank run with Northern Rock. The one before that was 150 years ago. And that frightened the whole world. And many countries, many regulators took measures to prevent bank runs. And supermarket runs are really new, and there is no fundamental reason for supermarket runs. So this wasn't in the UK alone, this was in the US, this was in every other country that you can think of. And everyone experienced the supermarket runs. And again, one of the products that was the target of the runs was the toilet paper, for example. And the supermarkets themselves in coordination, said, quote unquote, we can feed the nation, and they can feed the nation. And there is no breaking in the supply chains. There is no problem in the production of the goods we need, but still the system collapsed. There was a run on the supermarkets. And the way we wanted to study that, because the rationality, it's criticized, and alternative theories are there, and they're using the alternative theories as well, but the rationality of economic choice. So this is completely against the rationality of economic choice. It is irrational, because if you run the supermarket, then it's very clear that you will not be able to finish everything you bought, so it will be more expensive. And because you're creating a demand pressure, then the price will increase. And also we know that, there is enough meat to feed everyone, but there are cows that are not born yet. So you can't buy the meat that will be produced in July 2021 today. So this is completely irrational, and it's important to understand why such widespread irrational behavior took place in economic exchange. So one explanation, the way we approached this, the way we approached it was kind of like through a critique of the mainstream theory of the rationality of economic choice. Well, it isn't. And this is a big show for how irrational economic choice can be. But I wanted to join this group on trust because, on the other hand, this says something about the trust of the people as well. So it's very rare that people study trust in finance. I'm aware of only one paper produced by American colleagues, and they're using a bilateral trade measurement and related fund flows. But in this case, what we have, the theory of, when you look at the theory of trust, so what increases trust? Well, number one, just say that we trust, there should be uncertainty. So you can't say, I trust it's going to rain. No, there should be uncertainty, and within uncertainty, you trust. And in this case, there was uncertainty. So we didn't know what a shutdown meant. We didn't know how long it would take. There was uncertainty. And in this uncertainty, the trust can be based on various things. And one of the ingredients of the trust is, well, obviously familiarity. So we're in a very unfamiliar environment. We don't know what's happening. This hasn't been done before. We haven't seen a shutdown before. So there is complete lack of familiarity. And it's kind of like you're living in a small village where everyone knows everyone else, but someone from the outside the village comes. It's like an alien arriving the village. So you have no idea what's going to happen. And again, it's important that you know the appearance of the people, so you know who you're dealing with at a personal level. And like you've introduced us today, that we're in a virtual world, and it would be much better if we were in a room together so that we could see each other. And in this case, you don't know the other shoppers, so you don't know who they are, you don't know how they're going to buy, how much they're going to buy. But there was clearly mistrust among the households towards the other households. So they didn't trust that, despite the guarantees given by the supermarkets themselves, they didn't trust that the other households would buy enough for themselves. So they thought the other households would buy my share, and my kids will be hungry, my house will be empty. But at the same time, this ignores the vulnerable in the society. So if you have a credit card, and if you have a car with a big boot, yes, of course, you can buy a lot. But if you're living hand to mouth. And if your income is on a daily basis, well, you can't buy those quantities. If you're elderly and if you're living on a small income, although it's a permanent income, and you can't physically carry big amounts, you can only carry a small shopping bag, that's enough for one day. Well, you can't do that. And these will be the household groups that will be suffering from this this run, I should say, and that was completely ignored. So I thought, and we thought with Arman that this clip that we have just watched is very impressive because she's someone that we all need. So during this pandemic, she is a nurse. She's worked a very long shift. We all need her. We don't want her to be hungry. So it's not someone we can turn our eyes to, and we leave her vulnerable as well. Why? Because she's helping us and she's working overtime.
Brilliant. I'm actually very struck by the fact that I'm from Ireland. In fact, lots of us are from other parts of the world on this panel. And so we probably all have slightly binary experiences of the past year in terms of our countries of origin and here. And in Ireland, there wasn't a run on supermarkets and there was no food shortage. And all my Irish friends and family were saying, but what do you mean you can't get meat or toilet roll? And of course, a relationship to compliance and lockdown was also very different. So that's fascinating. I wonder, Gülnur, just finally and very briefly, I wonder, you mentioned 2008, and there it strikes me that recession was caused in some ways by a cataclysmic loss of trust in the logic of the financial system. Where there was almost a domino effect of a loss of belief or faith. We're now in a recession that's been caused by something very different. And do you think that means the recession will play out differently, that the cause actually shapes how the recession will go? Does that make a difference?
We don't know that yet, because the furloughs are not over. Again, with another author, Oliver Holter-Moller from Germany, immediately at the onset of the crisis, we estimated possible bankruptcy in the corporate sector. And we have a database that covers the small companies as well. So it's not only listed firms, large firms. We have micro companies, small companies, medium companies, etc. And we have done the initial estimations for a number of European countries. It's a European database we have. And for Germany and UK, we released the results. So this is a bankruptcy expectation. So what we're looking at is the firms do not cover their interest payment on debt. So it's not the repayment of debt, but it's the interest payment of debt. So if you can't service your debt, obviously that makes you prone to bankruptcy. So that's, you're on the road to bankruptcy. So those rates are very high. It's about 98, 99% in the shutdown industries, both in the UK and Germany. And when you look at the industries that are not shut down, if you have a car wash, for example, it's not a shutdown industry. You can continue to operate a car wash, but if nobody is going to work and everyone has plenty of time, who needs a car wash? Effectively, you get, you lose clients and you lose business. So even in the non-shutdown industries, we estimated bankruptcy rates around 60 to 70%. Now, to us, what's surprising, we're going to look at the actuals. The data is released end of March this year. So we will have to look at that after May this year. So the actuals, not the expected, but the actuals. And if firms are in a stage of bankruptcy, so they can't service their debt, and they're still kept alive, they don't go bankrupt, they're called zombie firms. So they're like the zombies, they're kind of dead, but still alive. So we're going to see how much of them are zombie firms. Okay. So these are very, very high ratios. So what we didn't see is a riot against the government and shutdowns. So partly it could be due to the concerns and the fear about lives, because of the pandemic, but partly it could be due to the trust in government, that the government, so this is, we're talking about the employees, we're talking about the entrepreneurs, the employers, and this is the vote base in every country. So, and furloughs or different sorts of furloughs and different sorts of borrowing was introduced both in Germany and the UK. So this could be partly also due to the trust in government that your company is not going to go bankrupt.
Brilliant.
So we don't see any discussion on the newspapers, in the news, despite the magnitude of a possible crisis. We don't see any discussion about that. And that I attribute to the trust in governments that they can't lose a voting base. We don't know what they will do, but the trust is, well, they have to do something if they want my vote.
I think that is a brilliant place to end, Gülnur, because we're going to move on to Mario to talk about how films have represented these questions. So thank you so much. That was fascinating. I'm going to ask all the panelists at the end to talk about their utopian and dystopian versions of the future of trust. So we might return to this question. Mario, this what Gülnur is talking about the irrationality of the sort of supermarket runs makes me wonder about the role that films have played in shaping our understanding or experience of the pandemic. And I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit, I know your work is on documentaries, and I'm wondering if you could talk about how documentaries or film more generally has shaped the public perception of pandemics in the past.
So I mean, interesting enough, when you look at the documentaries, there hasn't really been many of them before the COVID outbreak. And in fact, which is, when you simply think about how impactful pandemics have been over the period when cinema existed, so let's say 20th century, and if you just take that, smallpox has been estimated to have killed at least about 300 million people, and that you can, really, count notable documentaries about pandemics, on the hand of your fingers. It's pretty strange, and on the other hand, everybody has seen, like countless documentaries about World War II and what the Nazis were doing here and there, though in simply in terms of kind of body count, it's really hugely disproportionate now. By contrast, for instance, there have been, interesting enough, fiction films for a while now, which have represented pandemics in one way or another. And, you can track these things at least to around 1919. Now, whether that's some kind of a coincidence with the Spanish, with the kind of Spanish influenza or not, I'm not 100% certain. Probably it's not. But you can't and you can track this up to this kind of this pest, this German film, but which is interesting. It's not about influenza. It's about the plague in the medieval plague in the 14th, 15th century in Florence. And there has been this kind of a steady trickle of these films over the years. But it seems that when it kind of really came to the fore was when this. Well, I mean, I'm sure we're all familiar with this zombie genre, which I guess, relates to the zombie films. And it's really interesting how, in fact, this zombie genre has, it was initially sort of a supernatural phenomenon, which got around, I guess, probably the, what's it called, the 28 Days Later, the Danny Boyle film was the one that kind of, well, it wasn't the first one, but it definitely, in the popular imagination, reinvented the zombie as a pandemic. It's a virus which gets translated, which gets, communicated by blood and by essentially various kinds of, bodily fluids. and it's this, and it seems that this is the moment when we kind of somehow started imagining, one of the apocalypses as this kind of a zombie pandemic apocalypse, where it's really the infection somehow that has destroyed the world as we kind of understand. And interestingly, I mean, in a sort of a kind of a broad comparison to how there is little, for instance, work or fictional work on climate change, in the sense it's always easier to imagine a complete collapse, such as, I don't know, Mad Max or something like that, or a zombie apocalypse, than it is to imagine, something like this, where we're on Zoom talking to each other because, it's not really plague running around with 30% mortality rates.
Yeah.
But it is something which is, really changed the way we live. No?
I have thought, actually, Mario, that, we started probably the pandemic with those references in our minds. And certainly 28 days later has been a reference for me seeing empty London streets, that there's something about the way it staged that. And then really no one really expected an apocalypse to be quite so boring. And actually it feels to me that Samuel Beckett is really the writer of the experience of pandemic. Can I just pause for a moment, Mario, to make a tiny plug, which is to say zombies have now been mentioned twice here. We are actually running a conversation this evening at 7:30 on zombies. So please do come to that if that topic particularly interests you. Mary, in both documentaries and then fictional accounts, let's think about trust for a moment. So who gets treated as trustworthy or not in those fictional accounts? And how is vaccination imagined within the ways in which pandemics and disease and so on are represented? So let's take the first question first. Who's seen as trustworthy, generally speaking? I'm sure it varies.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, I can say, I can say who is definitely almost never seen as suspicious in documentaries, and that's kind of a frontline medical workers, and interestingly enough, it's the general population. It seems that in documentaries at least, it seems that citizens are never the ones who are regarded as somebody who makes dubious choices and goes out when they maybe should stay in self-isolation or something like that. No. And then again, depending on the type of kind of documentary film that you're seeing, and now maybe just for the some kind of reasons of generalization, maybe you can, at least from what I've seen now recently, maybe you can think about three types of general documentaries. Ones are these which are, let's say, critical of the governments, but it made in this kind of let's say a big kind of a production. I mean, big TV houses like BBC, ITV, I don't know, PBS, ABC. They will make usually films which are very, very trustworthy. They will be very trustworthy about kind of not only medical professionals but also experts. So like somebody like Anthony Fauci, or even somebody like Bill Gates, who is not really an expert, but somebody who has been on the kind of forefront of the public campaign and certainly in the kind of in the financing this kind of things from a philanthropic perspective. And they will regularly, so these films will regularly be very critical about the government, in the sense in the ways in which response could have been done only if the experts would listen to them. Whereas it seems that the more the more conspirational ones will have a bit of a worse thing going on, in which in fact it's the experts who are the troublemakers in one way or another. And in fact, government should be really not to kind of engage with these experts or kind of stay. And then there is a certain type of documentaries which is really about kind of experiences of people who are with
Sure.
illnesses or the, again, frontline personnel. But yeah.
That's so interesting, Mario. And I think that brings us beautifully to our next speaker around the conspiratorial and anxieties around privacy. So thank you so much for that contribution. I think it's fascinating to suggest that as Netflix was notoriously the thing people turned to for solace, it may also have been shaping our experience of pandemics. And in fact, it was the case, I think, that the most downloaded or, streamed films were all about pandemics in the first few months. So it tells us something about how much we need art to mediate our experience and explain it back to us, but may also be promoting or not promoting trust in particular kinds of expertise. Valsamis, I wonder, would you like to join us on that front? You are Professor of European Criminal Law and Global Security and Deputy Dean for Global Engagement. I know you'd like to show a film as well. And this is a film, as I said, you was sort of slightly ripe for parody because it's such a style of, it's almost like bureaucracy being performed. So Louisa, I wonder, would you mind playing us, well, it's not your film, Valsamis, I'm not going to attribute it to you. Let's have a watch of this and then see what we make of it. Thank you. I'm so struck, Valsamis, by the fact that we get the line that the EU will build a gateway, and of course gateways are also borders. So I'm interested to know, in your work as a legal scholar, what your response is to this idea of a vaccine passport, what implications it might have for questions of security and of privacy. So what do you think is at stake in a vaccine passport?
Thank you, I will not take ownership of this film. I think it was meant to elicit a response of how the idea of a vaccine passport is presented by the bureaucracy, the technocracy, which is entrusted to develop it in the European Union. And I think what is interesting is the attempt to link something which may potentially be very invasive for rights and for liberties to concepts of freedom of movement, and of equality, that everybody will be treated equally. So, and I think there is a lot we can discuss about this. I mean, just to begin with a broader comment linking to the other colleagues as well, presentations and comments. So I think the law is grappling here, about how to govern our lives in the current pandemic, because you have a twofold contested relationship. It's a trust of governments towards the citizens. So, it's government to citizens, but also the other way around, trust of citizens towards the government. And I think, you have this relationship which is ever expanding. And then in addition to that, what I wanted to show in this small film is the role of technology in underpinning these transformations of trust, if you like, and whether there is trust also in technology and in the infallibility of technology. So, so I think that there are many different layers that, we all need to be very conscious about unpacking and then unpicking. And I think as a general comment, there is a lot at stake because A, to what extent are we willing to cede some of our liberties away for the purposes of pandemic management? B, to what extent are we really sure that what is proposed as pandemic management is sound So is the vaccine passport really the solution to all of our problems currently? And C, I'm very interested in the question of the infallibility of technology in a sense, and whether we actually trust technology without asking too many questions about the impact of technological solutions into our everyday lives. And this is not only vaccine passports, but it's also digital apps. I think there was a very interesting article in The Guardian a couple of days ago where apparently Google and Amazon declined to consent to the development of the new NHS version of the app because they found that the UK government's version is too privacy intrusive even for their standards. So, I'm not even talking about privacy advocates, because they were saying that what the UK government want to do is, again, to centralize the collection of data, which is something that is specifically excluded in the decentralized models of development of apps by the tech giants. So, so there is a lot going on here, and what we're asked the citizens to swallow, if you like, in order to go to the pub, is not as innocent, in my view, as it seems. It
does speak to a kind of real government trust in the idea that vaccines going to sort this problem out too. There's a real faith in vaccination as a sort of key to unlock, and of course it's slightly unclear whether it will. I wonder, could you talk a little bit then about borders? I am so interested by this idea we're building a gateway, but it's not clear whether the gate is going to be open or not. And I'm struck by the convergence. I mean, Stella talked a bit about this too, about the convergence between Brexit and now this question of vaccine passports, that what we're seeing is a whole set of new borders emerging, or potential borders emerging. Of course, you've also got the symbolic border that a vaccination pierces, which is the border of the body, and the relationship between the body and the not body, and the ways in which vaccine might be mistrusted because of that kind of crossover. So how would you say that vaccine hesitancy articulates wider anxieties about the working of the state on our bodies, about the relationship between our bodies and borders? I mean, should we riff off that a little bit, Valsamis?
Yes, I think that these levels are kind of interlinked. So on the one hand, you have the level of vaccine hesitancy on its own, and what is the usefulness, if you like, of the vaccine, of being vaccinated to society. And then at the meta level, it is what being vaccinated can facilitate for you. So, so that there we have the vaccines being presented not only as a good health choice for the citizen, but also as a choice for your whole life. I mean, the use of the terminology vaccine passport, in my view, is very interesting. The fact that if you're vaccinated, it gives you freedom. It's not only freedom from disease, but it's also freedom to live your life as per normal, whatever that means, nowadays. So, so there is a really blurring of boundaries, I think, between these two discourses. So, it's, do we trust vaccines in order to keep us safe from COVID, or do we need vaccines in a very utilitarian way in order to help us travel or go to the pub or meet our friends? And, you may find actually, and I think in the UK, we perhaps are reaching this stage, and maybe David has thoughts on that as well, where people are being vaccinated primarily for the latter. So not so much in order to avoid getting COVID, but also in order to not to be asked questions if they want to go on their everyday lives, in a sense. So, so I think that it's hard to distinguish between the two, in a sense. And what I also find very interesting is that we are asked to give more and more of our private personal information to technological apps and to the state, including biodata. In terms of data protection law, you don't need me to tell you that health data are one of the most sensitive categories of personal data, where, they shouldn't be shared with anybody, and, they should be very strictly circumscribed. But, we are told that we must do this if really we want to go on holiday. And I think that there is something missing here, and there is a slippery slope, and I think that citizens should be very careful about what they give away for the sake of convenience.
We're going to turn to the whole group in a moment, Valsamis, and one of the provocations I'd offer the whole group was since we're thinking about the future of trust, what our utopian and dystopian versions might be, I think you are possibly invoking a dystopian version in which the word passport is probably not coincidental, because questions of citizenship become demarcated around vaccine inclusion or not, or the category of what it means to be a citizen, or what's required of you as a citizen. Looks like it might now require vaccination. That's a slight, I mean, I suppose I'm invoking, or you're invoking, a slightly dystopian future where citizenship is being determined not just by national borders, but by certain kinds of health borders as well.
I think that the danger with where we are now is that we create more borders and we stratify citizens more. So, you know, so we have different categories of citizenship, which does not coincide with national citizenship, if you like, or with your passport, but just to give you another example, it's unrelated to COVID, but you see the direction of travel. The European Union is proposing the introduction of almost an automated gate system in airports. You know, the UK has done something similar on the base of the premise of the concept of a trusted traveler. So, you know, who is the trusted traveler in a sense? You know, people who have give the data in advance, are frequent flyers, and they are deemed to be trusted and hence not controlled. And this, of course, has huge implications. I mean, it has huge implications also for equality before the law, you know, and what kind of, and my concern now is that what happens to those who refuse to be vaccinated in the first place, or what happens to those who are vaccinated, but they do not want to have an app, or, you know, or they do not want to have a digital vaccine passport, you know, in order to move. And I think this COVID amplifies these concerns, in my view, and serves really to multiply division and different categories of citizenship, which are fluid, which are not stable. So, you know, you may be trusted today, but you may be mistrusted tomorrow. And you're never really sure where you stand, in a sense. And I think from the purpose of certainty and the rule of law, this is really very pervasive.
Brilliant. Thank you, Valsamis. And I wonder if I could invite all the other speakers to join us now, which is, again, Louisa, doing your magic for us on the screen. Actually, David, when I was listening to Valsamis, it really struck me, you were talking about the fact that the trust in the NHS is by no means certain and may be lost. It's striking to me what Valsamis is describing is not actually necessarily the work of the NHS, but will have its name on it. So when we're looking at the NHS app and so on, is that another threat, in a sense, to the trustworthiness of the NHS? Is its role in, or even symbolic role in, enforcing things like vaccine passports?
No, definitely. I think it's a real risk, and the NHS logo is being used for all kinds of things, which are not really appropriate in my view. So, you know, that's something I didn't bring up earlier, but I think, you know, that's really an active erosion in the public's trust in the NHS. It won't be long before people understand that the NHS logo does not represent necessarily the NHS that they think about or believe in. Yeah. I
mean, again, it sort of draws me back to my sort of melodrama parallel, where we get the heroes who are the individual health workers, but we then get the facet of the working of the state in a particular kind of complexion, which then renders it villainous, in a sense. It sort of becomes the equivalent of the landlord or the bailiff, or those figures of domination that people booed in melodrama. And there's a peculiar tension there in the ways that the NHS is framed rhetorically in relation to trust, it seems to me. I wonder if I could ask everybody now to pile in. I sort of gave you all an instruction before we started this, which was to please converse, and I'm not going to get in the way. So I wonder if we could note perhaps the differences in our approaches between versions of trust, of commonalities of engagement. I wonder if we could offer a particular focus on how interdisciplinary approaches might help to tackle vaccine hesitancy or frame it differently. I'd also like to encourage the audience to start jumping in. And in fact, do I see a question? And I do, from Tessa Wright. Hello, Tessa. It's lovely to see you up here. So you have said that David's point about increased commercialization of NHS is likely to affect trust in health professionals. Are there any lessons from the marketization of higher education, which has deeply affected the relationship between lecturers and students? It's not an exact parallel, but it perhaps offers some warnings. I think that's brilliant, Tessa. Thank you. Any responses to that question? I think that's a really interesting parallel, that the commercialization of higher education has recalibrated the ways that academics are seen by the student body, or universities are seen by the student body.
I've always found it interesting that there are some people who don't like the fact that the NHS is structured the way it is, in the sense that it's publicly funded, it's free at the point of use. There's some people that actually want to be able to personally buy and purchase their own healthcare. That there's a kind of psychological makeup with some people that they choose not to trust. And I've seen that a little bit with education as well. That the mark of a good quality course is, you can tell by the price. So they equate quality with price. So yeah, I think there are parallels between healthcare and education. But I think the key issue is really trust between the professionals and management, both within education and in the NHS. And what we're really seeing, I think the big crisis is between healthcare workers, frontline healthcare workers, and their relationship with government, their relationship with the Department of Health, their relationship with senior managers. And that's where there's been a breakdown.
There is some very interesting work done on the emergence of the manager historically, and the ways in which because management is actually quite a recent form of work. And one of the ways that management justifies itself is by trying to make all work look like management. And what's difficult sometimes is when you have forms of work like academic work or medical work that doesn't look like management, there's this unintelligibility which has to be sort of translated into management systems or language, which then alienates the people doing that work. There's some brilliant work by Richard Sennett on craft, actually, who dedicates a whole chapter to NHS workers and thinking about medical practice as a kind of craft with commitment that then isn't understood by management language. And I think that tension there does produce a form of mistrust and alienation, which I think is fascinating. It's actually a historical problem that emerged at the end of the 19th century, and we are very much living it out now, I think. Does anyone else want to jump in there in relation to your views on that multidisciplinary approach to producing trust, or indeed guiding or directing it? Anyone else want to jump in? Gülnur.
Sorry, it's not a direct answer to Tessa, but I think I'm going to make a comment about marketization. So, we're talking about it for NHS, we're talking about it for higher education. In the field of economics and finance, I think one discussion that is no longer made is about the market structures. When I was a student in the 1980s, we would make distinctions about monopolies, oligopolies, natural ones, and perfect competition. Now, even if the industry is monopolistic or oligopolistic, we assume there is competition. So in this pandemic as well, there is a move. So, I mean, some of the industries, when I was a student, the example for monopolies was the railroads. It's meaningless to have two railroads to connect Manchester to London. One is enough, so that's a natural monopoly. And similarly today, well, one Facebook is enough. You can't have two Facebooks, otherwise you can't bring everybody together. Or similarly, Amazon, one Amazon is enough because you can't bring small Amazons together. So these natural monopolies of today, and maybe to me, the education sector maybe, especially if you go online, will be a monopoly. And one person teaches finance, there is no other alternative. or one person teaches classics, and there is no other alternative. And if you're broadcasting online, well, we can have a monopoly there as well. So I think what I find lacking in the current situation is in my discipline, we've moved there slowly, but we need work in differentiation of market structures and related regulation. So, we're all clear that, if there is one railroad, then there should be regulation, because otherwise, they can charge £2,000 to travel from London to Manchester. So, we kind of understand that it has to be somewhat cost-based. So similarly, today's monopolies are different from yesterday's, but we need some regulation given the circumstances, given the technology, and given the new lifestyles that we have.
Thank you, Gülnur. I wonder if I could keep encouraging the audience to throw up some points. Joe, you've just added a note around vaccine hesitancy, which I think is really useful. Thank you. I wonder, could I ask the panelists just to share their dystopian and utopian futures around trust and vaccine hesitancy? What would you hope for? What would you fear? What might you want? Should we do a little bit of predicting, perhaps? I know academics don't like doing that because we have to be uncertain and make things up and speculate. Anyone want to jump in with some predictions? Stella?
Well, I don't know if I want to jump in with some predictions, but maybe share some ideas. I think there are some underlying themes. I wouldn't say only for the vaccination hesitancy, but about the COVID-19 pandemic in general, that we mentioned here in the discussion, about the importance of community, but also of technology. And for me, it's these two issues that create the utopian and dystopian views. So if we learn from what we experience, and which is very possible, if you want me to be, and maybe I'm always optimistic, then we can learn from everything that we have seen, and be in a situation that we can communicate better as experts and as governments. We give public funding where we should. We see that the state has a renewed role in this pandemic, and everybody has accepted it. But at the same time, we take into account the importance of the private sector. We have climate change ahead of us, and without the private sector, we cannot do anything. So this division between public and private cannot be the same. But if we go to the dystopian view, maybe there we become lazy, we trust the technology too much, we stay too much in front of our screens in our enclosed rooms, and then we lose the community and thus trust. I'm trying not to think about that too much, because we're still quite locked down. But yeah, these were my thoughts. Thank you.
Thank you, Stella. Anyone else want to offer some dystopian or utopian futures? David?
I'm very optimistic about the pandemic, but I'm very pessimistic about everything else. And it goes back to what Gülnur was saying, there's in just about every sector, growing monopolization, growing oligopolization. What we're really talking about is this increasing concentration of power and wealth across society globally. And COVID has made it worse. We've seen, eye-watering inequalities become even more unequal over time. And it's really, the problems are at the upper end of the spectrum, where we're just having so much concentrated power and wealth, and these inequalities are problematic in their own right, but they fundamentally undermine good governance, they undermine democracy, and those are things that I feel very, very pessimistic about, and it touches on some of what Valsamis was talking about. And just final point, that the distinction between public and private is really important. But I think we need to be much more nuanced, and we should be talking about, the even bigger distinctions between big, giant multinational corporations and small businesses, and between good government and bad government, rather than just a public-private distinction. Yeah.
David, while I have you there, there's a question from Eleni who's asked about the complexity of vaccine hesitancy in relation to the fears around virus mutation. I don't know if you have an immediate response to that question, but how this question of mutation has sort of become a new part of the narrative in the past 6 months, I suppose.
Yeah, well, I mean, viruses do mutate, and vaccines can be developed, and vaccines can also, if you like, mutate in the laboratory, obviously. So that's a natural phenomenon. But I do feel that, you know, even if you look at Tower Hamlets, for example, you know, where there was initially a lot of vaccine hesitancy, over the last 3, 4, 5, 6 weeks, we've begun to see vaccine coverage really grow, and that's partly because people have now know of other people who've been vaccinated, and there's not been any of the kind of horror stories that they may have seen on social media. So I think that the issue of vaccine hesitancy is also partly related to the lack of regulation on social media and the allowance of misinformation to continue. So, you know, regulation, I agree, is being a really important issue as well. Yeah.
Brilliant. Thank you, David. Anyone want to jump in with our final dystopian futures or utopian ones? I have to say, just for my sake, and this is nothing to do with vaccine hesitancy, but I was very struck by, if we think about who governments trust, they certainly don't trust artists, and they haven't done really for a long time. But the very fact that they got so little support, and individual freelance workers, putting artists aside, are really not trusted to be real workers and have not been properly supported in the furlough system. One thing I do hope in my utopian version is that people suddenly realize how important art is, both to help mediate experience and as forms of solace, and how much we miss it when we can't have it. It's something I used to do as a hypothetical exercise with my students, is to defend the existence of actors, imagining that we could never access them. And of course, in a certain way, certainly in the theatre, that has come true. And so my utopian hope is that we might value not just art, but the people who make it for us more highly. My dystopian fears are that that's really not going to happen. Valsamis, do you want to finish us up with a utopian or dystopian thought?
Well, I mean, I spoke a bit about dystopia, so, you know, let's talk a bit about utopia. I think there are opportunities here. There is an opportunity for better communication and justification, I think. You know, I think that a lot of colleagues talked about explanation, you know, as a component of trust. So, you know, when someone explains to us why certain decisions are taken, what is the evidence behind them. And I think the fact that there is skepticism can also have a healthy component within it. So, you know, so I think it is important for citizens not to be complacent, to question decisions, and to require, if you like, justification and explanation, especially by governments. And I think that with all the drawbacks of the current system, the fact that, you know, there is a recourse to scientific explanation is not a bad thing, I think, compared, you know, to what was happening before. Another hope, perhaps, would be a hope for further cooperation and collaboration globally and more multilateralism, because we have all seen how interdependent we all are, and I think we cannot really address this very complex problem only at the national level. I think this is really, you know, not feasible. It's not really discussed as such, especially in the UK, interdependence and how, you know, we need to work with each other. But I think that permeates, I think, all our analysis from all our disciplines, in a sense.
That's such a good note to end on, Valsamis. Thank you. It's a real kind of call to arms for us all to work together more. And this conversation is a real example of that. So I just want to say an enormous thanks to all our speakers. I'm imagining you all out there in the sort of digital void, applauding, so I'm going to applaud for you. Thank you all so much also for joining us, and I'm sorry we can't see you, but I hope that very soon we will be able to gather in rooms and perhaps restage this conversation with further updates on the research that's being done here. I just want to plug the fact that we have an event going on the future of mobility at the moment, and then 2 further events, one on the remembering the Bangladesh War of Independence at 6 o'clock, and then appropriately an event on zombies at 7:30. So please do join us for those and other conversations during the week. And thank you again so much to all our speakers. And now we will all sit in a slightly awkward silence while everybody logs off. There is that equivalence to saying goodbye to somebody and walking down the street in the same direction as them. So thank you all very much, and see you very soon for more conversation. Take care.